I'm sorry, sir. Your name isn't on the guest list. The young wedding coordinator looked at her tablet, frowned, and checked it again, then a third time. I, I must have the wrong list, I said, forcing a smile. She shook her head politely. No, sir. I've checked every table assignment. I don't see your name anywhere. Around me, guests laughed as they walked through the ballroom doors. Waiters carried trays of champagne. Somewhere inside, a string quartet had started playing Can't Help Falling in Love. Then I saw my son Daniel, standing beneath a crystal chandelier, smiling for photographs with his bride. He never looked toward the entrance. He never knew I was standing less than 50 feet away. Or maybe he did. I tightened my grip on the wrapped walnut jewelry box I'd spent weeks choosing for him and Emily. The coordinator lowered her voice. Would you like me to call someone? I looked through the glass doors one last time. Emily's parents were being escorted to the head table. Her uncle was greeting guests. Her cousins were everywhere. But somehow, the father of the groom wasn't invited. No, I answered quietly. I think I've seen enough. My name is Richard Hale. I'm 68 years old, retired, widowed. And until that evening, I believed there wasn't anything I wouldn't do for my only son. Looking back now, that drive home probably changed both our lives. The wedding was held outside Nashville. I lived just outside Knoxville, 4 hours each way. I'd left before sunrise because I didn't trust traffic around the city. At my age, driving after dark wasn't my favorite thing. But for Daniel, I'd have driven across the country. The navy blue suit I wore was the same one I'd worn at my wife Linda's funeral 3 years earlier. She had bought it for our 40th anniversary. It's timeless, she'd said while straightening my tie. You'll wear this to every important family occasion. She wasn't wrong. I just never imagined one of those occasions would end with me sitting alone in my truck outside a wedding venue. The gift beside me wasn't extravagant. Daniel had always admired handcrafted furniture, so I'd commissioned a local woodworker to build a custom walnut keepsake box. Inside, I'd placed Linda's old handwritten recipe cards. Emily loved baking. Linda had always hoped she'd pass those recipes to our future grandchildren. Now, the box stayed unopened on my passenger seat. I started the engine. No tears, no anger, just silence. Daniel wasn't always like this. Growing up, he was the kind of kid who waved goodbye twice before getting on the school bus. When Linda got sick, he spent every weekend helping around the house. He mowed my lawn without asking. He drove his mother to chemotherapy appointments when I couldn't leave work. Back then, I thought we'd done something right. After college, Daniel started a small residential construction company. Business was good at first. Then came rising material costs, a couple of bad investments, one commercial project that fell apart halfway through. By the time he and Emily bought their first home outside Franklin, Tennessee, things were already getting tight. I never wanted them to know how worried I was, so I quietly stepped in. The down payment, half came from my retirement savings. Daniel insisted he'd pay me back. I smiled and told him to focus on building a life. A year later, cash flow got worse. He called one evening, sounding embarrassed. Dad, I hate asking. You don't have to. I might fall behind on the mortgage. How much? He hesitated. I'll figure something out. You just did. That was the beginning. What started as one mortgage payment became another, then another. Eventually, I set up automatic payments directly through my bank. Daniel never asked again. Neither did I. 3 years, 36 mortgage payments. Not because I was wealthy, far from it. I had a comfortable retirement, Social Security, a modest pension, some savings Linda and I had built over 40 years. Every payment meant postponing another home repair, skipping another vacation, driving my old pickup another year. I never regretted it. Helping your child isn't supposed to feel like a burden. At least that's what I believed. When Daniel announced he was finally marrying Emily, I couldn't have been happier. Linda hadn't lived long enough to see it. That hurt. But life doesn't wait for grief to finish. The invitation arrived 6 weeks before the ceremony. Something felt odd. No handwritten note. No love Daniel. Just a printed invitation. Even stranger, there was no seating information, no rehearsal dinner details, no RSVP card. I called Daniel. Did something get left out? He laughed. Dad, don't worry about it. What time should I be there? Just come. Everything's already handled. Simple enough. Or so I thought. On the morning of the wedding, I stopped at a florist and bought fresh white roses. Linda's favorite. I planned to leave them at the small memorial table couples sometimes set up for loved ones who couldn't be there. I never found out whether there even was one, because I never made it past the front door. The drive home felt longer than 4 hours. About halfway back, I pulled into a quiet rest area. I opened the walnut keepsake box and ran my fingers across Linda's recipe cards. Her handwriting looked exactly as I remembered. Neat, patient, gentle. She used to tell Daniel something whenever he'd make a mistake. Character isn't measured by how you treat people when everyone's watching. It's measured by how you treat the people who will love you anyway. I wondered if he'd forgotten, or if I'd simply failed to teach him well enough. I reached home close to midnight. The house felt exactly as it always did. Quiet, predictable, safe. I hung my suit back in the closet, placed the unopened gift on Linda's old sewing table, then sat in front of my computer. I logged into my online banking. There it was. Automatic mortgage transfer. Scheduled. First business day of every month. I stared at it for almost a full minute. No anger, no speech, no dramatic goodbye. I simply clicked Cancel Automatic Payments. The confirmation screen appeared. Are you sure? For the first time in 3 years, my answer wasn't difficult. I clicked Yes. Then I shut the computer, turned off the lights, and went to bed, knowing that somewhere in Tennessee, my son had no idea his life was about to become very different. The first morning after the wedding, I woke up expecting to feel angry. Instead, I felt lighter. Not happy, not vindicated, just lighter. For 3 years, I'd carried a responsibility that wasn't mine anymore. Every month, before I paid my own bills, I'd made sure Daniel and Emily's mortgage payment reached the bank on time. I never thought of it as charity. It was simply what fathers did. At least, that's what I'd always believed. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat on my back porch overlooking the small patch of woods behind my house. A pair of cardinals landed on Linda's old bird feeder. She loved those birds. She used to say they reminded her that someone was always watching over us. I wish she were watching now. She would have known exactly what to say. Life settled into a familiar rhythm. Monday mornings, I volunteered at the local Habitat for Humanity warehouse. Tuesday afternoons, I met 3 retired friends for coffee at the same diner we'd been visiting for nearly 15 years. On Wednesdays, I mowed my lawn. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just ordinary American retirement. Only one thing had changed. My checking account no longer lost nearly $2,000 at the beginning of every month. I didn't realize how much breathing room that gave me until I saw the numbers. For the first time in years, I scheduled repairs on my truck instead of hoping it would survive another winter. I finally replaced the leaking water heater Linda had wanted me to change before she passed. I even bought myself a decent recliner after sitting in the same worn-out chair for nearly 20 years. Every purchase came with the same guilty thought. I should have done this sooner. Then another voice answered, No, you simply stopped paying someone else's bills. Daniel never called. Not after the wedding, not to ask whether I'd made it home safely, not to explain why I wasn't allowed inside, not even to thank me for the gift he'd never received. At first, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the wedding planner made a mistake. Maybe Daniel thought I'd been seated somewhere else. Maybe, but every passing day made those excuses harder to believe. A person who truly cared would have called. 1 day, 2 days, a week, anything. Silence has a way of revealing truths words try to hide. A few weeks later, I stopped by the bank to review some retirement investments. My longtime banker, Melissa, smiled as I sat down. Looks like your monthly expenses dropped quite a bit. They did? She glanced at the screen. You finally canceled that recurring transfer. I nodded. It was time. She didn't ask questions. Professional people rarely do. Instead, she smiled and said something that stayed with me. Sometimes helping someone too long keeps them from learning how to stand. I thought about that all the way home. Maybe I'd confused love with protection. Maybe I'd been rescuing Daniel from lessons he needed to learn himself. Linda had warned me once, years ago. Daniel had forgotten to repay a small loan I'd given him. I laughed it off. Linda didn't. "Richard," she'd said gently, "help him when he falls, but don't carry him after he can walk." At the time, I thought she was being too strict. Now, I wasn't so sure. 3 weeks after the wedding, I opened a kitchen drawer looking for batteries. Instead, I found an old Father's Day card. Daniel couldn't have been more than 12. The front read, "To the best dad in the world." Inside, he'd written in crooked handwriting, "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." I sat there for a long time holding that card. People don't become strangers overnight. It happens one compromise at a time, one excuse, one lie, one decision to impress the wrong people. I wasn't grieving the man Daniel had become. I was grieving the little boy I'd once known. Exactly 1 month after the wedding, my phone buzzed while I was grocery shopping. I looked down. Daniel. Not a phone call. A text. I smiled for just a second. I thought maybe he'd finally realized what he'd done. Maybe this was the apology. I opened the message. "Dad, the mortgage is due." That was it. "No. How are you?" "No." "I'm sorry about the wedding." "No." "Can we talk?" Just 4 words. "The mortgage is due." I stared at the screen while shoppers pushed carts past me. One woman accidentally bumped my shoulder. "Sorry." "It's all right." She apologized faster than my own son had. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, finished shopping, bought chicken, vegetables, coffee, and a slice of apple pie. I drove home, put away every grocery bag, fed the birds, and made dinner. Only after washing the dishes did I pick up my phone again. I read the message one more time. It still sounded less like a son talking to his father, and more like an employee reminding accounting to pay an invoice. I typed 6 words. "Then I suppose you should pay it." I read them twice, no insults, no lectures, no passive aggression, just the truth. Then I pressed send. The response came almost immediately. My phone rang. "Daniel." I let it ring. Voicemail, another call, then another. 5 missed calls in 15 minutes. A sixth, a seventh. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. I didn't listen. Not yet. If he'd wanted to talk to me, he'd had an entire month. The next morning, there were 3 more texts. "Dad, answer your phone." 5 minutes later. "This isn't funny." 10 minutes after that. "The payment didn't go through. Call me ASAP." Still no apology. Still nothing about the wedding. The mortgage remained more important than his father. I put the phone face down and went outside to trim the hedges. About an hour later, my neighbor Frank wandered over carrying 2 fishing rods. "You still coming Saturday?" "I wouldn't miss it." He looked at me carefully. "You all right?" "I think so." "You sure?" I smiled. "Frank, have you ever spent years solving someone else's problems?" He laughed. "I've got 3 grown daughters." "Then, you know," he nodded. "The hardest lesson isn't learning to help. It's learning when to stop." That evening, curiosity finally got the better of me. I listened to Daniel's first voicemail. "Dad, I don't know what's going on, but the bank says the payment wasn't made. There has to be some mistake. Call me." Mistake. He honestly believed it was a banking error. Not once did he wonder whether the man paying his mortgage might have had a reason to stop. Not once did he ask whether I was hurt, only whether the payment had failed. I deleted the voicemail. Then I looked out the living room window. The sun was beginning to set. For the first time since Linda died, I realized something painful. I hadn't just been paying my son's mortgage. I'd been quietly financing the illusion that actions had no consequences, and sooner or later, every illusion comes due. The knocking started just after 8 on a Saturday morning. 3 hard knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I already knew who it was. Frank, my neighbor, wasn't due for another hour. He always texted before stopping by. Daniel didn't. I opened the front door. He looked exhausted. His suit was wrinkled. His beard hadn't been shaved in days. And there were dark circles under his eyes that reminded me of the long nights I'd spent beside Linda's hospital bed. "Dad, morning?" He stood there awkwardly, as if waiting for me to invite him inside. I stepped aside. He walked into the house he'd grown up in. Nothing had really changed. Linda's quilt still rested across the back of the couch. Family photographs still lined the hallway. The grandfather clock still chimed every 15 minutes. Daniel looked around as though he hadn't noticed those things in years. You've kept everything the same. I like remembering. Neither of us sat down immediately. Finally, he cleared his throat. The bank says we're 30 days behind. I know. You canceled the payments. I did. Why? I looked at him for a long moment. You really don't know. His eyes dropped to the hardwood floor. I figured maybe something happened with your finances. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything that had happened, his first assumption was still about money. My finances are fine. Then why? I pulled out a dining room chair. Sit. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. Why wasn't I at your wedding? Daniel rubbed his forehead. Dad, it wasn't supposed to happen like that. Then tell me how it was supposed to happen. The planner messed up. I nodded slowly. I see. It was chaotic. Hundreds of guests. Mistakes happen. I agree. He looked relieved. Then I asked quietly, so why didn't you call me afterward? His relief disappeared. You had 4 weeks. I've been busy. Too busy to ask whether your father made it home after driving 4 hours? He opened his mouth, closed it again. There wasn't a good answer, because there wasn't one. He finally said the words I'd been expecting. I'm sorry. It sounded practiced, automatic, like apologizing after bumping into someone at the grocery store. Not after leaving your own father standing outside your wedding. I looked at him calmly. Are you sorry because you hurt me? He hesitated. Or because your mortgage payment disappeared? He didn't answer. That answer told me everything. The doorbell rang. Daniel frowned. You expecting someone? I believe so. I opened the door. Standing outside was Emily. She looked embarrassed. I didn't know Daniel was already here. I didn't either. She stepped inside holding a small bakery box. I brought cinnamon rolls. Linda used to bake cinnamon rolls every Christmas. Emily remembered that. I appreciated the gesture. We sat around the kitchen table. No one touched the pastries. Emily spoke first. Richard, I owe you an apology. I found out something yesterday. She looked toward Daniel. You never told me. Daniel stared at the table. Emily continued. I thought you made the mortgage payments. Silence. She looked back at me. I honestly believed Daniel had everything under control. I folded my hands together. I didn't think it mattered who paid. It matters now. She turned toward her husband. You told me your business covered the house. I was trying to protect you. From what? From worrying. Emily shook her head. No, you were protecting yourself. The conversation unraveled quickly after that. Daniel admitted he'd never told Emily about the automatic transfers. He'd let everyone believe the house was secure because of his successful business. Even Emily's parents thought he'd become financially independent. In reality, every first of the month, my bank account quietly carried the weight. Emily looked stunned. For 3 years? I nodded. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I wasn't buying gratitude. I smiled sadly. I was trying to buy my son time. She wiped tears from her eyes. I had no idea. I know, and I believed her. Then I asked the question neither of them wanted to hear. Who decided I shouldn't attend the wedding? Daniel answered too quickly. No one decided that. I stood, walked to the hallway, and opened a small drawer beside my desk. Inside was a folded envelope. I returned and placed it on the table. Open it. Daniel looked confused. Inside were several printed emails. He frowned. What is this? The wedding coordinator sent them. Emily looked surprised. Why would she contact you? Because 2 days after the wedding, she mailed an apology. I hadn't told anyone, not even Frank. The coordinator felt terrible. She'd recognized me from the entrance. Apparently, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She'd written, Mr. Hale, I feel you deserve to know. This wasn't an accident. Attached were copies of the final seating chart revisions. Daniel's face turned pale. Emily reached for the papers. Near the bottom, one line had been crossed out. Richard Hale, table 2. Beside it, someone had handwritten, "Remove." Another line appeared beneath. "Seat assigned to Harold Whitman." Emily frowned. "Who's Harold?" I answered quietly. "Your father." She looked at Daniel. "Daniel, you replaced your dad with mine." "No, you literally removed his name." "It wasn't like that." She flipped through another page. There it was, an email from Daniel to the planner. "Please make the adjustment discussed earlier." No explanation, no misunderstanding, no planner mistake. Emily looked as though someone had knocked the air out of her lungs. "You lied." Daniel buried his face in his hands. "I didn't know how to explain it." "Try." He couldn't. Finally, he whispered, "My father-in-law was helping pay for the reception." Emily stared at him. "So, he wanted more family members at the front, and you thought the solution was removing your own father?" "I thought—" He stopped, because there was no sentence that could justify what he'd done. I spoke softly. "You know what hurts most?" Neither of them answered. "It isn't missing the wedding. It's knowing my seat existed." I pointed at the papers. "You gave it away." Emily suddenly stood. "I'm going outside." She walked onto the back porch. The screen door closed behind her. Daniel remained frozen in his chair. For the first time since arriving, he looked less worried about the mortgage and more afraid of what he'd become. I wasn't interested in humiliating him. Life was already doing that. But deep down, I had the feeling the missing mortgage payment was about to become the smallest problem in his marriage. Emily stayed on my back porch for nearly 15 minutes. Neither Daniel nor I moved. Through the kitchen window, I could see her standing beside Linda's old flower bed. The roses were blooming bright red against the white fence. Linda used to spend hours tending those flowers. She believed if you cared for something long enough, it would eventually bloom. Sometimes people weren't so different. Sometimes they were. Daniel finally looked up. "Dad?" I didn't answer. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness." "No," I said quietly. "You don't." He swallowed hard. "But I didn't want to humiliate you." I folded my arms. "Then what exactly did you want?" He searched for words that didn't exist. You just what?" "I didn't want conflict." I nodded slowly. "So avoiding conflict meant embarrassing your father instead. It wasn't supposed to happen at the door?" I couldn't help but sigh. "Daniel, whether you rejected me at the front entrance or by email a week earlier, wouldn't have changed anything." He looked away. The decision had already been made. A few moments later, Emily came back inside. Her eyes were red. She sat down without looking at either of us. "I called my mom." Daniel looked surprised. "Why?" "Because I wanted to know if she knew." Emily stared straight ahead. "She didn't." He blinked. "What?" "My parents thought you wanted to keep the ceremony small." She turned toward him. "They had no idea your own father wasn't invited." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "My dad asked me several times why your father wasn't at the rehearsal dinner." Emily's voice cracked. "I told him you said Richard wasn't feeling well." She shook her head in disbelief. "I defended you." The room became painfully quiet. I wasn't shocked. When people lie once, they usually have to build another lie to protect the first one. Eventually, they forget which version they told to whom. Emily reached into her purse. "I found something else." She placed several credit card statements on the table. "I wasn't looking for them. I was trying to find our insurance paperwork." Daniel immediately knew where the conversation was going. "Emily." "No." She held up one statement. "Explain these." There were charges from expensive steakhouses, luxury hotels, designer clothing stores, and golf resorts. Daniel rubbed his temples. "I can explain." "Please do." He looked embarrassed. "Some of it was client entertainment." Emily slid another statement toward him. "$30 $900 at a jewelry store." He said nothing. "Business." Still nothing. I quietly stood. "This isn't my conversation." Emily stopped me. "No, Richard. You deserve to hear this." Daniel looked absolutely miserable. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't want anyone thinking I couldn't provide." Emily stared at him. "So while your father was paying our mortgage, You were pretending to be successful. He nodded. I thought business would recover. When? I don't know. You bought watches. I was trying to look successful. You bought vacations. I thought appearances mattered. Emily laughed bitterly. They mattered more than honesty. I suddenly understood something that had bothered me for years. Daniel had never asked for more money because he didn't have to. He already knew I'd quietly solve the biggest problem every month. That left him free to spend what he earned trying to impress everyone else. Not because he was evil, because he'd become addicted to appearances. And I had unknowingly made that addiction possible. That realization hurt almost as much as the wedding. Emily looked at me. Richard, I'm so ashamed. I smiled sadly. You didn't create this. No, but I benefited from it. She wasn't wrong. Whether she'd known about the mortgage or not, she'd lived in the house my money protected. She looked toward Daniel again. You know what hurts most? He didn't answer. You didn't trust me enough to struggle together. I was just trying to give you a better life. You were giving me a fake one. Daniel suddenly looked at me. Are you going to let us lose the house? It was the first question he'd asked me that morning that wasn't about himself. There was fear in his voice. Real fear, I answered honestly. I don't know. Emily looked surprised. You don't know? I spent 3 years preventing consequences. I leaned back in my chair. Maybe it's time consequences taught what I couldn't. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. They'll foreclose. Not tomorrow, but eventually. We can catch up if you have the money. He lowered his head. I don't. For the first time, he admitted the truth. Business wasn't simply slow, it was failing. Several projects had gone unpaid. 2 subcontractors were threatening legal action. Credit cards were nearly maxed out. The checking account barely covered payroll. I listened without interrupting. 3 years earlier, I would have opened my checkbook before he finished talking. Now I simply listened. When he was done, I asked one question. Have you told Emily all of this? He shook his head. Emily closed her eyes. So, the mortgage wasn't the only secret. No. She looked exhausted. I married a man. I didn't realize I married a performance. That afternoon they left together. Not because everything had been resolved, because nothing had. As Daniel reached the front door, he stopped. Dad, yes? I really am sorry. I believed he meant it this time, but regret and responsibility aren't the same thing. I know. Can we fix this? I looked past him toward Linda's flower bed. Broken trust isn't repaired with promises. It's repaired with choices. He nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not sure you do. He accepted that answer without arguing. For the first time in years, he left my house without asking me for anything. 3 days later, I received an unexpected phone call. It wasn't Daniel. It was a loan officer from the local bank. She politely confirmed that I was no longer making the mortgage payments. I just wanted to verify the recurring transfers have permanently stopped. They have. Thank you, Mr. Hale. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me. The homeowners have contacted us requesting a hardship modification. So they weren't waiting for me anymore. They were finally talking to the bank, trying to solve their own problem. That was progress, small but real. I walked outside that evening carrying a watering can. Linda's roses needed watering. As I poured water around their roots, I realized something. Love isn't always giving people what they want. Sometimes love means stepping aside so they can become the people they were always supposed to be. Whether Daniel succeeded or failed from here would finally depend on him. Not me. About 2 weeks passed before I heard from Daniel again. This time he didn't text. He didn't call. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, he knocked on my front door carrying a cardboard box. He looked different. Not because he'd suddenly become younger or healthier, because the confidence, the kind that had always seemed tied to expensive clothes and polished shoes, was gone. He looked honest. Can I come in? I nodded. He set the box on my kitchen table. I brought a few things. Inside were several expensive watches, a designer leather briefcase, golf clubs, an unopened tablet, even a high-end espresso machine. I looked at him. Cleaning out the house. He managed a weak smile. Selling everything that isn't necessary. I closed the box. That's a start. He nodded. It won't cover much. No, but that's not the point. He accepted a cup of coffee, and we sat in silence for a while. Finally, he spoke. I met with the bank. How did it go? They agreed to delay foreclosure proceedings. That's good. If, he stopped. If we make 3 consecutive payments, I nodded. And can you? I don't know. For the first time in years, he wasn't pretending to have all the answers. Oddly enough, that gave me hope. Over the next several months, something unexpected happened. Daniel stopped asking me for money. Instead, he started asking me for advice. Not about finances, about life. Sometimes he'd stop by after work just to sit on the back porch. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we simply watched the sunset. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. Emily came too. She often brought dinner, not because she felt obligated, because she wanted to. One evening, she handed me a small paper bag. Inside were homemade cinnamon rolls. I finally learned Linda's recipe. I smiled. They smell exactly right. She laughed. I had to make them 6 times. Linda would have loved that. Daniel eventually sold the expensive watches, the golf clubs, the designer clothes, the luxury things that had once convinced him success could be purchased. None of it solved every problem, but it changed something far more important. It changed him. The construction business survived, barely. He downsized, took smaller projects, worked longer hours, and paid his subcontractors first. For the first time, his reputation wasn't built on appearances. It was built on honesty. One afternoon, he asked me something I never expected to hear. Dad, why didn't you give up on me? I looked across the yard toward Linda's roses. Because your mother never did. He smiled quietly. I don't think I deserve that. Probably not, I smiled back. But love isn't something people earn. He nodded slowly. I understand that now. Maybe he did. Maybe he was still learning. The truth is, we both were. Families don't break apart all at once, and they rarely heal all at once either. Healing happens one honest conversation, one difficult choice, one forgiven mistake at a time. Not every wound disappears. Some become scars, but scars don't always remind us of pain. Sometimes they remind us that we survived. A few days later, Emily called. Richard, would you mind meeting me for lunch? We met at a small diner halfway between our homes. Nothing fancy. The kind of place where everyone called the waitress by her first name. She looked exhausted but determined. I wanted to tell you something before Daniel does. I listened. I sold my engagement ring. I looked up. You didn't have to. I wanted to. She smiled sadly. It wasn't the diamond that made us married. What did you do with the money? Paid off 2 credit cards. I couldn't help smiling. Linda would have liked her answer. Emily stirred her iced tea. I was angry. I know. But now I think I understand something. What? You weren't trying to punish us. No. You were forcing us to face reality. Exactly. She nodded. I wish we'd learned that lesson sooner. So do I. Over the next month, I heard bits and pieces from mutual friends. Daniel had sold one of his company trucks, canceled the country club membership I'd never known he had, stopped leasing expensive equipment he barely used, and even took on remodeling jobs himself instead of subcontracting everything out. One afternoon, Frank stopped by after seeing Daniel at a hardware store. You know, he said while helping me stack firewood, your boy was loading lumber into his own pickup. I've never seen him do that. I smiled. I used to. Frank chuckled. Maybe he's finally becoming a contractor instead of pretending to own an empire. Then came another surprise. One Saturday morning, Daniel called. Dad. Morning. I need a favor. I waited. Not money. That made me smile. I need advice. About what? The bank wants a realistic budget. I've never made one. You've run a business for 10 years. I know. You always assumed next month would fix this month? There was a long silence. Yeah. Come over. For the next 4 hours, we sat at my dining room table, surrounded by receipts, invoices, tax returns, and legal pads. I showed him something my father had taught me decades earlier. Every dollar needs a job. He laughed. I've heard people say that. Most people don't do it. We categorized every expense: necessary, optional, waste. The waste pile grew disturbingly large. Luxury subscriptions, unused software, business dinners that never produced clients, a leased luxury SUV, 3 streaming services, premium gym memberships no one used. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I can't believe I let it get this bad. It didn't happen overnight. No, it happened one excuse at a time. He looked at me. I sound like you. I smiled. That's not the worst thing in the world. As we finished, he quietly asked, Can I ask you something? Of course. When you stopped paying, were you trying to hurt me? I answered honestly. No. He looked surprised. I was trying to stop hurting myself. He frowned. I don't understand. I spent years believing love meant protecting you from every consequence. I folded the budget papers neatly, but every month I solved your financial problems. I gave you permission not to solve them yourself. He stared at the table for a long time. I never saw it that way. I know. I thought you wanted to help. I did, but helping and enabling aren't always the same thing. A week later, Daniel invited me somewhere. Dad, there's someone I want you to meet. He drove me to one of his job sites. It wasn't a luxury development, just a modest ranch home owned by an elderly widow. Inside, Daniel introduced me to Mrs. Alvarez. She smiled warmly. Your son refuses to overcharge me. Daniel looked embarrassed. I just charge what the work actually cost. Mrs. Alvarez laughed. He told me, I'd rather build trust than another invoice. As we walked back outside, I glanced at him. That's new. He smiled. I've been thinking about what you said. What part? About character. I looked confused. He continued. Mom used to say, character isn't measured by how you treat people when everyone's watching. I stopped walking. You remember? I remember everything. He swallowed hard. I just forgot to live by it. That evening, before leaving my house, Daniel placed an envelope on the kitchen table. What's this? Open it later. After he left, I did. Inside was a handwritten note. Not typed, not rushed. Handwritten. Dad, I kept wondering why you never yelled at me. Now I know. Silence gave me room to hear my own mistakes. I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back the wedding you deserved, but I promise you'll never have to wonder where you stand in my life again. I want to earn back your trust, not buy it. Love, Daniel. I folded the letter carefully. Then I placed it inside Linda's walnut keepsake box. For the first time since that terrible wedding day, it finally held something worthy of being kept. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The maple trees lining my street turned shades of orange and crimson, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself looking forward instead of looking back. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens one honest conversation, one difficult decision, one kept promise at a time. Daniel was learning that. So was I. 3 months after the wedding, I received another invitation in the mail. This one wasn't printed by an expensive stationery company. It wasn't wrapped in ribbons. It wasn't designed to impress anyone. It was a simple white envelope. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Inside was a single card. Dad, would you come to dinner Sunday? I already saved you a seat. I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. Sunday afternoon, I drove back to Franklin. The same 4-hour trip, the same highway, the same truck. Only this time, I wasn't carrying a wedding gift. I was carrying Linda's walnut keepsake box. When I pulled into Daniel's driveway, the first thing I noticed was what wasn't there. The luxury SUV was gone. The landscaping service signs were gone. The expensive patio furniture had been replaced by a simple wooden picnic table. The house looked lived in, not staged. Emily opened the front door before I reached it. This time, she didn't simply smile. She hugged me. I'm really glad you came. So am I. Inside, the smell of pot roast filled the house. It reminded me of Sunday dinners Linda used to make. The grandchildren ran into the living room. Grandpa! I hadn't realized how much I'd missed hearing that word. Emily laughed. They've been asking all week when you were coming. Then Daniel walked into the room. He looked healthier, not richer, healthier. He wasn't wearing a designer jacket, just jeans and a flannel shirt with sawdust still clinging to one sleeve. He looked more like the young man who used to help me build fences than the businessman who had spent years pretending to be someone else. Without saying a word, he handed me a framed photograph. It was their wedding portrait. I recognized it immediately. Only something was different. The original photograph showed Daniel and Emily standing between her parents. This version had been professionally edited, not to rewrite history, but to create the memory we should have shared. There I was, standing beside my son exactly where I should have been. I looked up. Daniel's eyes were already wet. I know it isn't real. No, I said softly. It isn't. I can't change what happened. I know, but I wanted you to know. His voice broke. That's where you always belonged. I set the frame on the table. Then I hugged my son for the first time in years. Neither of us said anything. Sometimes silence finally says the right thing. Dinner was simple: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, homemade rolls, no caterers, no crystal chandeliers, no seating chart, just family. As we finished dessert, Daniel stood and tapped his glass with a spoon. I'd like to say something. Everyone looked toward him, including Emily's parents. I owe someone an apology. He looked directly at me. When I planned our wedding, I cared more about impressing people than honoring the man who spent his life taking care of me. The room was completely silent. I convinced myself appearances mattered. I thought success meant looking successful. I was wrong. He paused. The strongest man I know drove 4 hours to celebrate me, and I left him outside. Emily reached for his hand. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Then he turned toward his in-laws. I also owe you an apology. Her father frowned. Daniel continued. I blamed all of you for decisions you never made. Emily's father slowly stood. I wondered where Richard was that day. I should have asked harder. He walked across the room and extended his hand toward me. I'm sorry. I shook it. So am I. There wasn't any bitterness left, only sadness for time we'd never get back. After dinner, Daniel and I sat on the back porch while the children played in the yard. The bank approved the modification, he said. Congratulations. We've made every payment ourselves. I know you have. He smiled. How? I asked Melissa. He laughed. You've still got connections. I have friends. He looked out across the yard. I almost asked if you'd start helping again. I raised an eyebrow. Almost. I realized something. What? If I asked, I'd be proving I hadn't learned anything. I nodded. You've learned. I have. We'll finish paying off the house ourselves. I believe you. And when we do, he smiled, I'm taking you on a vacation. I laughed. As long as it's round trip. For a second, he looked confused. Then he burst into laughter. So did I. It was the first time we'd laughed together in a very long time. Before I drove home, Daniel walked me to my truck. Just as I opened the driver's door, he stopped me. Dad? Yes? I used to think success was owning a bigger house. He glanced back toward the porch, where Emily and the kids were waving. Now I think success is having the people you love still willing to answer the phone. I rested a hand on his shoulder. Don't waste that lesson. I won't. When I got home that evening, I carried the walnut keepsake box into my living room. Inside were Linda's recipe cards and Daniel's handwritten letter. I added one more thing, the new family photograph, not because it erased the old pain, nothing ever could, but because it reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Families don't become perfect because they never break. They become stronger because someone chooses to repair what was broken. I placed the lid back on the box and set it on the bookshelf beside Linda's photograph. She smiled the same way she always had, quietly, patiently, as if she'd known all along that love without truth cannot last, and truth without grace cannot heal. Outside, the evening sun slipped behind the trees. The house felt peaceful again, not because everything had been forgotten, but because everything had finally been faced. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of someone you love, don't wait for the perfect moment to tell them. Life changes faster than we expect, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone isn't money. It isn't success. It isn't even forgiveness. Sometimes it's simply making sure they always know they have a seat at our table. But because it reminded me that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it gives the future a chance. Linda used to say that families aren't held together by perfection. They're held together by humility. Someone has to admit they were wrong. Someone has to choose forgiveness. And both choices take courage. If you're listening to this story today, maybe there's someone in your own life you've been taking for granted, or someone you've been waiting to forgive. Don't wait for a wedding, a funeral, or a crisis to remind you what really matters. Tell people you love them while they're still here to hear it. And if this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed your family forever? Share your story if you feel comfortable. And if you'd like to hear more stories about family, second chances, and quiet justice, consider subscribing and joining us for the next one. Thank you for spending this time with me.